We've been working with Ken for the last 2 years, and we must confess we've been stunned by the speed at which we've been able to work this tool up. So without any more ado, would you please welcome Ken?
Thank you. Well, thank you, and I really appreciate you coming and giving me an opportunity to introduce you to some of the new tools that I've been working with Quentin and Margarita on developing. So I want to get back to that pretty picture that was showing up on the screen, or maybe not so pretty once we see what is actually showing about worst case culture. But I want to provide first some background about the theoretical model. One major focus that we have in terms of trying to make culture something that we can actually identify and talk about and communicate about is to focus on social norms. Social norms are how group members will typically interact and communicate with each other. So just as some examples, now that you've actually taken the measure, you'll maybe recognize some of these are straight off of the items. Do group members tend to speak up when they disagree or keep quiet? Do they tend to compete with each other or avoid competing? Do they encourage others' input, or do they discourage it, and so on? So this is what we mean by a social norm. So why are we focusing on social norms? I want to give you three the key reasons why this has become our focus. One, social norms can influence every organizational process and outcome, including efforts to change other aspects of culture. If you just think intuitively about what it's going to take to change any other element of culture, it's going to certainly require those sorts of interpersonal and communicative processes that we're focusing on. Secondly, these can be perceived and measured. Every member can describe the current social norms, which is what you were invited to do, and what might be better norms to have. What would be the ideal processes that we'd like to see? And thirdly, the social norms can be efficiently summarized and communicated. In particular, we can capture and organize a diversity of social norms with one simple model, the interpersonal circumplex. So the interpersonal circumplex, sometimes just abbreviated as IPC, shown here, encompasses social behaviors ranging from friendly to dominating to hostile or separating to submissive and everything in between. So we can think of the circumplex like a social compass that helps us to map and to navigate our social world. So of course in physical compass, the cardinal directions are going to be north, south, east, and west. And on the circumplex, the cardinal directions are up here at the top, being agentic or standing out, being unagentic here at the bottom or laying low, being communal, which we place here over on the left in terms of that's cooperating, connecting, being open and listening, and then finally being uncommunal, competing or disconnecting from your coworkers. So these cardinal directions actually anchor what we have found empirically over many decades to be the fundamental axes of social life, which are agency, a dimension of getting ahead, and of communion, a dimension of getting along. The research suggests this is evident in all social groups, whether we're looking at small teams, large organizations, and entire societies. And these are regulated by distinct neural and endocrine processes. Now that we can hook people up into fMRI machines and have them engage in various types of social cognitive tasks, we can look at different endocrine processes like testosterone and oxytocin. So it has a very deep research base. Now the broad utility of the circumplex was actually first detailed in Timothy Leary's 1957 book, Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality, from which this figure is taken and which earned our American Psychological Association Book of the Year award. The sociology of why the circumplex has waxed and waned in popularity over the years is something I'd be happy to talk about over drinks. It's an interesting story in and of itself, but not something I have time for now. But the important thing I want to point out is it's experienced a real resurgence in the last 10 years. And so what this graph is showing is the number of scientific papers referencing the interpersonal circumplex per year over the past 10 years. And in 2008, about 175 papers a year were referencing the interpersonal circumplex, and that's gone up to over 400 papers last year. But it's been mostly among personality and clinical psychologists that the popularity has increased. One distinctive exception to this are the instruments that Quentin and Margarita have been disseminating. The Circumplex Leadership Scan 360, which uses the IPC to measure interpersonal behavior of organizational leaders, and I've already chatted with a couple of people here before this started that experienced that measure, and the CBS 360, which uses the IPC to measure interpersonal behavior of other members of the organization. So what we wanted to do now was to complement these existing measures by adding new measures, the circumplex measures that assess the social norms characterizing either an organization, and that's the Circumplex Culture Scan, or CCS, or a particular team within the organization, and that's the Circumplex Team Scan, or CTS. So, what do we do to develop these measures? We tested 226 potential items. So the items that you just took are a small subset that were rigorously culled. So we tested the potential items in 1,676 employees in the United States and Canada, and kept the 64 that best encompassed the entire circumplex space. Outside the circle here, in very tiny font, are the CCS, CTS items, and their approximate locations based on their correlations with every other item. So these are not us theoretically placing them here. This was us using very sort of vector analytic methods to automatically locate the items in their proper place. And each 16th here is given a name that captures the feel of the 4 items within that particular segment of the space. But for convenience, when we're giving feedback, we divide the space into options, 8 styles that are being captured. So let's just zoom in on each one to give you a feel. So up here in the agentic and slightly communal region, you have courageous and confident cultures where members are acting boldly and decisively. Moving a little bit to the left here, a little less communal but equally agentic, are competitive and pushy cultures in which members are competing for attention and prestige. Moving into the even a less communal region of the space, we have rude and combative cultures, members forcefully struggling for power and dominance. Equally uncommunal, but moving into the less agentic regions of the space, you have evasive and guarded cultures in which members are ignoring or warily avoiding each other. Down here in the really unagentic regions, we have timid and hesitant cultures. Members are anxiously avoiding appearing assertive or ambitious. Equally unagentic, but a little more communal, you have your yielding and cautious cultures in which members are carefully avoiding conflict or controversy. Moving into the more communal region, respectful and modest cultures, members are humble, caring, and supportive. And finally, back here in the more, I'm not touching anything. I don't know what happened there. What we're seeing is real elevations, in this region of the space. That worst case teams are going to be characterized especially by rude and combative cultures. To some extent, cultures that are too competitive and pushy and evasive and guarded. Different people are going to have different experiences. So in some cases, the worst case cultures are going to be ones in which there's a lot of vying to get attention, to get power. And others, the real problem is going to be being too hesitant and timid and people not speaking up and everyone laying low and keeping their head down and avoiding controversy. So there's different worst case scenarios, but the worst case scenarios are certainly going to be hovering in this region of the space. And real deficits in these social norms, they're the social norms that are actually going to allow teams to be successful, to be confident, to speak up, to engage, to listen, and to respect each other's contributions. Cultures that are going to be producing good outcomes are characterized by agency and communion. And the cultures that are typically the ones that people are considering worst case scenarios are lacking in either agency and or communion. Here's an example of a team back from my university in the United States, a team that I ran really just to pilot the interface, but it ended up producing a lot of interesting results and interesting feedback for the team, which really confirmed just how useful these measures are, because I was expecting this to be just a normal functional team, and it ended up having some dysfunction. But what we see here is what we're usually going to ask people to do is both the current culture and their ideal culture. And so here we see the ideal culture for this particular team, which is typical, that people do intuitively recognize that what's going to be ideal is to have a team characterized by agency and community, engagement, openness, and so forth. When we looked at their current description, we found deviations from that, and that's when these traffic lights turn on. Now, the yellow is meaning that, warning, you're tending to show inadequate levels of courageousness, confidence, engagement, and openness in this particular team culture. And you're showing too much here in the timid and hesitant region. And of course, when you get even more extreme, then the traffic light goes from yellow to red. It's saying, you are really not, you're an atypical team in being showing these problematic social norms. But it's sufficient, when this turns yellow, to say this is something the team really needs to pay attention to. And as soon as they got this feedback, especially comparing, which I think is the really most striking, is when people compare the ideal team they have in mind with their actual team, and they see that juxtaposition, it becomes quite clear where the deficiencies are that they need to correct. In fact, I saw it in terms of no one wanting to explain what was the source of this discrepancy. And everyone was very timid and hesitant, and they kind of were putting their head down and avoiding my eye contact. It's like, well, here we see that team culture at work. So then we did some general field testing then in Australia. I think we're up to 1,000 individuals now that have been in the field testing, but at the time that I did these initial analyses, we had 787, but for simplicity, I'm going to show the combined CCS and CTS results across organizations and teams. There were 45 of them, from which we obtained descriptions of both actual and ideal social norms, we compare, and responses from at least 4 members, allowing us to compute an average or consensus view. So it's not, could be overly influenced by someone who really wants to be nice in describing their organization or really wants to stick it to their organization. And we're looking at the overall, the averages here, which are going to really show the consensus. What we see here in the squares are basically the average of the averages. Here's the typical social norms are shown here in the squares. The way this always works is that the further you are from the center, the more that social norm characterizes your group. And the good news is that most groups, most organizations and teams are characterized more by the positive and negative social norms, but they certainly deviate from their ideal. Shown here in the pink circles are the typical ideal social norms that people would like to see characterizing their team or organization. And these are highly statistically significant discrepancies, with people preferring there to be less of these problematic norms of being evasively guarded and rude and hesitant, and more of the norms of being courageous, confident, engaged, open, and respectful. So we also include in the CTS and CCS 12 outcome items, which are assessing quality of products and services, group cohesion, engagement, employee safety, and satisfaction. And what I'm going to show you is just average across all 12 outcome items. Is there a relationship between the successful group, being a successful group, and having a particular set of social norms? And the answer is very clearly yes. So what we see here in the brown squares is the typical social norms for the groups that were 1 standard deviation below average in their outcomes. For quality, for safety and satisfaction, for group cohesion. And in the blue diamonds, we're seeing the typical social norms of the groups that were 1 standard deviation above average in terms of their group outcomes. And we see these discrepancies again, that the more successful groups are showing less of the evasiveness and the guardedness and the hesitancy, more of the engagement, the openness, and the respect. Final data that I want to show you is now just, it's a busy slide, but all I've done really is to add back on the ideals that people have rated for the social norms for their team or organization. And what we see is that the ideals shown here in the pink circles align very closely with the actual social norms of the more successful groups. So what is that telling us? It's saying that moving a team or organization's actual culture closer to greater alignment with what their ideals are is likely to improve outcomes. So that's our hope for the CCS and CTS. It's going to provide a set of tools that can help clarify and to specify, to actually provide very specific social norms that can be for the target for change. And when you actually give the feedback, you're not just saying, here's where you need to go. We can actually then drill down and look at the specific items, the specific behaviors, where there are gaps between the ideal and the current functioning of the group. All right, well, thank you.